Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So in the previous episode, we didn't take the engine out of the Mark II, but we went ahead and did an autopsy on it and tried to figure out exactly how coolant was making its way into the oiling system, and I think we figured that out pretty well. So with this car, it's going to be probably a couple of episodes until we get back to it, as I need to take this bin over here that's full of all of the parts that will be reused on the new engine. This needs to go up to Russ for him to clean all of this stuff up. And I guess we'll get back to it before too long, actually, but I need to start getting the engine bay prepped to paint. As the more that I thought about it, I really need to paint this engine bay now, otherwise it never will be painted, never will get done. So it'll be a lot of work to do so, a lot of components will need to be pulled off of this, and a lot of prep work will need to be done in order to get it in a state where paint can go onto it. But we'll cross those bridges when we come to them, and we have not arrived at them yet. So what we're going to work on today is the Mark IV Supra. And I'm going to start working on the breather system and getting it wrapped up. So I had ordered this from Billet Pro Shop, which you can see the little Canadian maple leaf there, a Canadian billet shop. And what this is a dual number 16 ORB pass-through. And what we're going to be doing with it and the fittings and hose ends and everything in this box, as well as an order that I just placed for the rest of the components, we're going to get the breather system squared away on this so it stops leaking oil everywhere. And I guess we'll address maybe a couple of other leaks as we're working our way through this project as well. Now with this number 16 pass-through, it does have a decently sized dimension to it, meaning that I can't just put it anywhere. And the more that I thought about it and looked around, since the dry sump tank is on the driver's side and two of the breather fittings are there, I really want to keep this pass-through on the driver's side somewhere. And I want to keep it out of the way, out of sight, out of mind, and there really isn't a good location on the firewall itself to place it. So I started looking around under here, and there's a spot maybe back alongside the side of the chassis in there where I'm shining the light, but that would be kind of a nightmare to get things tightened down. And looking at the interior architecture of the car, there isn't a good place for the fittings to be on the inside of the car, as it's multi-layered, or it has an architecture that does not lend itself well on the inside of the car for hose ends and everything else. So the best location that I can come up with for it is kind of right in this area right here. Now it's out of the way of the tire, and there's still plenty of room to get hose ends onto the onto that pass-through and everything else. I can keep the lines tucked up out of the way so that way they won't come into contact with the tire, and it keeps multiple lines from running their way through the engine bay and adding additional clutter and everything else, as the engine bay is already packed enough as it is. So we need to take this plate and make a little template so that way I can figure out where it will be located underneath of here and start getting it where I can punch the holes through, or punch the pattern of it through, to actually get it going through that portion of the sheet metal and ready to accept the lines. So without further ado and without any more droning on, let's go ahead, make that template, and we can start making progress with this. not a ton of footage of the process, but the little billet pass-through is now installed. So let's take a look at it. So put the fender back on as well, obviously, and there is what we have. So I smeared some RTV around the perimeter of it just to kind of seal it up to that bit of sheet metal there, but that puts us in a real good location for both of the breather lines to enter the car and then run towards the rear of it, towards the burn down tank. So that was not the most fun job to do. Between cutting the hole, getting the angles with tools was the main thing, but getting all those angles, getting everything cut and fit, getting the fasteners tied down, it was really kind of a pain. But it's done now, and we can move on to actual line construction. So I have to wait for my other components to arrive. Hopefully they will in the next day or two. And at that point, I'll be able to go ahead and get the breather system wrapped up for this, stop blowing oil all over the engine bay and the ground, and start making use of that big blowdown tank in the rear of it. But that'll be it for today. I'll catch up with you guys as soon as those components come in, and we'll keep going with this. The other day, after we finished up installing the bulkhead in the Supra's wheel well, I went ahead and ordered all of the hose ends and fittings and different materials in that regard that are necessary to build those breather lines. However, those are out for delivery today as opposed to actually being here already. So to kill time in the interim period, why don't we go ahead and fix a couple of issues with the car. So before we talk about those, my RTV around the bulkhead trick seemed to work out. Granted, it isn't the prettiest thing in the world having a gray RTB patch right there, but it seals up that bulkhead to the structure of the sheet metal there, which is what I was interested in. So the first issue that we're going to work on is actually the transmission pan leak. And I'm sure some of you guys have seen it in other videos, I've just never addressed it. We have a nice puddle of transmission fluid on the ground here, or at least the majority transmission fluid, and that is due to our transmission pan gasket here. Now, this is one of the Moroso gaskets. It was supposed to be a really good thing, but ended up not being quite so good. And to be quite frank, I'm sick of slipping in that puddle on the ground and getting transmission fluid in my hair as I'm working underneath of the car. So over here should be everything that's necessary, hopefully, to fix it. I have a new Felpro gasket, a couple of cans of brake clean to clean up that puddle on the ground there, a drain pan, a pour little container deal here, and then another case of Type F ATF just to have it in stock and to fill up any residual that gets left behind in the drain pan or anything like that. So before we do anything else, I need to drain the existing fluid out of this. And it's still new fluid. I should be able to put it right back in when everything is said and done. But before I drop the pan out, I need to get the fluid out of it first. So let's go ahead and do that, and then we can start making forward progress, hopefully forward progress, with sealing this transmission up once and for all. The fluid that came out of the Supra's transmission still looks beautiful. So nice and ruby red, not really any abnormal metal in it or metal fragments. It doesn't look like a crazy pearl paint, and didn't have any chunks that came out of it. So I'm assuming that everything on the inside of the transmission is doing well. So now that the fluid is out, we can go ahead and actually drop the pan out of it. So I'm hoping that I can fit tools between the mid pipe and the transmission pan to get that out, but I might end up having to drop the mid pipe out of the way. Actually, I think I'm going to do that just to provide myself a little bit of extra space to work. It's 2 V-bands, it drops right out. There's no reason to make it more difficult on myself than it needs to be. So let me go ahead and do that. Start loosening pan bolts and hopefully not make a giant transmission fluid mess with any residual on the inside of the transmission on the ground. The pan is off and the old gasket is removed. So this isn't a perfect science of seeing where things were leaking, but we can see a whole lot of moisture on the front side here and kind of a witness mark right along here where fluid was being allowed to make its way past the gasket. Maybe some on the back side as well, but these gaskets, being that they are a little bit squishy, it's hard to get in the correct amount of torque applied to them to actually make them seal up properly, as opposed to the cork or cork-ish gasket that I have over there that hopefully will do a better job than the Moroso gasket. So let me grab a light real quick. We can actually take a look at a rare glimpse of the inside of the transmission. So with all this being in place here, you can see the extreme automatics. That's the trans brake solenoid. You can see the billet valve body in there, and there's not a whole lot else. I guess you can see some of the, I guess what would that be, the drum or something like that up through this gap right there, and then all the other fancy pretty stuff underneath here that makes the transmission do transmission stuff. So it's obviously better to see all these things when they're laid out on the bench or something along those lines, but even still, it's a nice kind of a rare glimpse of the inside of the transmission on this thing, as I don't plan on having this pan off with any frequency. So I'll let this thing kind of drip off as it needs to, and then I can go ahead, get the mating surface cleaned up, and yeah, you can see it's dry along there, real wet along the front side, so on and so forth. But I'll let this finish dripping, then I can clean the mating surface up on both the pan and the transmission case itself, get the new gasket in place, and before too long we'll be able to put the pan back on, refill the transmission, and hopefully the leak will be solved at that point. The pan is clean, the new Felpro gasket is in place, and I put a skim coat of RTV on the pan side as well as the top of the gasket. So this thing should be ready to go back in the car now, and I can put the transmission fluid back in it. I'll let this tack up for a little bit and seal up for a little bit first, then put the fluid in, and so on and so forth. And hopefully when all is said and done, there are no more leaks. So let me go ahead and get the pan back in place, and fingers crossed that this works. Well, with the new gasket in place on the transmission fluid pan, we don't have any immediate fluid put down on the ground. So I tried to check the level, which is going to be difficult right now as there's going to be residual fluid in the actual dipstick tube itself. So I'll have to wait for that to drain down the rest of the way. Start it up, check the fluid level that way. But at least for right now, the transmission has as much fluid, or as close to as much fluid as I could get back into it. And I have a box of 12 additional quarts of Type F ATF over there that I can always dump in as needed if the need arises. So the transmission pan, that leak hopefully will be solved. I won't know for a little while at least, but we can now move on to other leaks. And if you see on my cart right here, my hose end and hose order came in. So we have all the number 10 stuff to this point, number 12 stuff here, number 16 stuff. We have the number 16 ORB fittings here, some number 16 hose, and I think we should be about ready to get this breather system sealed up once and for all. So I'll need to take my little Y blocks that I made and figure out where they are going to be mounted. I'll have to make little mounting pedestal, mounting feet deals for them. I can get them mounted on the architecture of the car, wherever they need to be located, and start running hoses. So I guess the only thing left to do is to get to it. So let's go ahead and do just that. A little while later, we now have the two Y blocks located on the Supra. So the number 10 Y block is situated right here on the firewall. That gives me a nice path with two 90s off of the valve covers over to a 90 and a 30 on the number 10 side, a 45 on the number 16 side. That will go down through the hole underneath of the fuel pressure regulator, if you can see it. So underneath here is the number 12 side, and I was very limited on the locations that I had at my disposal to make this work, and I think I found probably the best option that I could have. So off of the dry sump tank, the lines will snake down through kind of this pocket right here. They'll snake up around, giving as much clearance as I possibly can to the wheel and tire when they're installed on the hub here. We have a 60 on the outside, 45 on the inside, and 45 on the number 16 side that will come over to our 90-degree fitting going into the bulkhead. And that's pretty self-explanatory there. So the only thing odd with the bulkhead, and what will be kind of a pain, will be the first thing to do tomorrow, as I'm about to get out of here for today, is to use this tight radius ORB to number 1690 that will need to go on the top side of the bulkhead, if you guys can see that there. So the reason these things are a little bit cumbersome to work with is to make the line, you have to thread this fitting in, thread the fitting out, so on and so forth, and spinning on this axis with this lower nut portion to the actual 90-degree bent portion right there can be a little bit cumbersome to make work. But it's what will need to be done, so that's what I'll need to do. So first thing tomorrow, that will be the order of business. And then once that line is squared away, we can move on to the other ones. But like I said, it's late now. I have other plans for the evening. I need to get out of here. So we'll come back tomorrow, get the plumbing done for all of this, and hopefully by the end of the day tomorrow, we'll have a variety of leaks that are solved on this car, and we can see if there are any more that need to be addressed at a later point in time. Today is plumbing day for the Supra, or plumbing day part who knows how many. But we are going to plumb up this breather system and get from the valve covers in the oil tank all the way to the back of the car to our burn down tank here. So you guys may remember when I built this, if not, I did videos on the construction of this tank a while ago. But what this is essentially a gigantic catch can. So the intent with this tank is if the engine loses seal from the combustion chamber to the crankcase, then all the cylinder pressure that the engine is producing goes through the crankcase and through the oiling system. And if I would have a small catch can up in the front of the car, it would immediately overflow that, put oil down potentially underneath of the rear tires in the drive axle, and could very easily end up putting me into the wall or something like that. So we're obviously trying to avoid that. So that is the purpose of this tank. It's a gigantic catch can, sits behind the drive axle and has essentially an exhaust stack that if it does fill up and overflow, it will shoot upwards through this hole in the hatch right here, free and clear of the drive tires. And at that point, I just have the irritation and the unfortunate circumstance of a blown up engine as opposed to a blown up engine and a wrecked car. So hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully this will go pretty smoothly. So we need to go from those valve covers in the oil tank up front all the way to the back here to our burn down tank, and all will be well that way. I'm also going to need to pull this tank out first and put a little 8th NPT bung in place, as this is also going to serve as the overflow for the transmission. So rather than having multiple tanks, I'll just consolidate everything into this tank, and everything should be well that way. So without further ado, let me go ahead and get my little 8th NPT bung, mark location, pull the tank out, drill a hole, weld, so on and so forth. You guys know the deal. And once we get that done, we can put the tank back in place and start building these lines. The burn down tank now has its 8th NPT bung in place, and I went ahead and put all of the fittings and all of the hose ends and everything that are going to be on it for the time being. So we have this little 90-degree airline fitting right here. This will be for the transmission overflow. We have number 16 ORB fittings going into the tank. We have number 16 45-degree hose ends that will connect the two hoses coming from the front of the car back to this tank. And down here, if you guys can see it, we have our number 10 ORB drain that is tight. Yeah, it's tight so it isn't going to end up weeping any fluid out should there be anything put into the tank immediately. So now this whole rear section is squared away, and we can start building the lines on the front of the car. So like I said at the end of the clip in the previous day, we have to start out by fighting this into position. And this is our number 16 tight radius to ORB 90, and this needs to be tucked up in here past this number 1690 right here. This will be the top side fitting, and it will snake through this hole right here and come over to our number 10Y merge right here. So I'm going to put a section of hose on this fitting to start, so that way I knock one of the items on the to-do list in building this hose off immediately, And then it's just a simple matter of marking out hose length, pulling it back apart, assembling, and then it should be able to go in for the final time, and I can start working on the other hose at that point. So let's go ahead and get this put in there, get the nightmare out of the way first, do the hardest thing first, and then the rest of it should be downhill from there. Well, we have another example of why it pays to never get rid of the parts that you order. So I changed up how I'm building these lines. So initially I was going to put the tight 90 on the top and the loose 90-degree bend that I have on the bottom of the bulkhead. Now, the more that I thought about it, I need to keep this line that's on here right now tucked as tight to the metal of the car as I possibly can, just for tire clearance and to make sure that I don't have interference that way. So I used that tight 90 on the bottom, and I had an extra 30-degree hose end, or number 16 30-degree hose end that will be used on the outlet of the number 12 merge. And these two things combined tuck the line as tight as it possibly can be to this portion of the car's architecture and provides me with the most clearance that I can possibly have. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this line, pull everything back apart, cut, assemble, so on and so forth, and at that point in time we'll have this line completed. We can move on to the engine bay side line, the number 10 merge, and that other line in preparation to move, or to get the 4 smaller lines made and then move backwards towards the rear of the car. The initial difficulty of this breather system has been conquered. So we have on the top side here, out of the number 10 merge, we have our number 1645, snakes down through that hole in the chassis there and makes its way around into our top port on the bulkhead. The lower port on the bulkhead makes its way over to our number 12 merge, and we are now ready to make the 4 lines that make their way into the 2 merges. So hopefully these won't be too difficult. I'm not really working with tight confines the way I was with those number 16 lines, so it should go a little bit more smoothly. So let me take a breather for a few minutes, and then we can get started on making the actual breather lines that make their way to the merges. Well, the 2 number 10 lines off of the valve covers are now completed, ran to their little merge, and we have all of the lines under the hood and under the fender completed. So now we'll need to go, and this will be the tricky part, under the dash. See if you guys can see this. Right up there, maybe. Yeah, where the black paint is, that's where the bulkhead is. So the fun thing about this is I can fit myself upside down under the dash, but I can only get one hand in there. So I'll probably make use of one of Sean's hands, and he has 2 of them, and we'll get these things tightened down, get the hoses made, and before long this breather system will be completed, and that'll be another big item off the list for this car. I should probably apply for a job at the circus with the amount of twisting and contorting that I've done. But the two number 16 lines are ran from the bulkhead all the way back to the burn down tank. And they aren't ran in exactly the path that I would have desired, but with the architecture of the cage, I did the best that I could. So they run from the back there, up along here, behind my seat, alongside of my seat, down here, underneath of one of the cage bars, and up to the bulkhead. So, again, not the ideal path, but made the best of the hand that I was dealt, and everything will work perfectly fine. So, at this point, the only thing left to do right now is to make the transmission vent line. And it just uses some normal air line like I use for all the boost control lines and everything. So I just have to drill a hole somewhere in the sheet metal here, run the line up to the transmission case, hook it up, tie it up, and then that will be all said and done and all good to go. The transmission breather line is now ran from the transmission case back to the puke tank in the rear of the car. And it was a little bit difficult to get this done, as my big gorilla hands trying to fit it with the exhaust out of the way, mind you, trying to fit my hands up between the transmission case and the chassis. Not the easiest thing, but I was able to get it done, and the line's connected and all is well there. So it's this air line right here, runs through the fuel lines and brake lines along the frame rail there, snakes up around over top of the subframe, and comes out. You guys probably can't see it, but right there, it runs up to that hole that I drilled in the sheet metal in the rear and up to the puke tank. So all is well there, but I need to lower the car down, torque that front wheel that I had off to build all of these lines. Need to put the couple of seat bolts back in, as I was planning on removing the seat to do all of this, but I would have had to pull the dash, and I wasn't getting into all of that right now. But I have to knock a few things out, and then we can start this thing up and make sure that there are engine smells coming out of the puke tank, and at that point we will have a great success. There is certainly an ethanol odor coming out of the puke tank in the back. So I would say that this is another job successfully completed. And we put a few additional lines in, did some plumbing, fixed a leak, And there's still a little bit of an engine oil leak, but from where it looks like it's coming from, that will be something that needs to be solved when the engine actually comes out of this car, as I'll probably need to take the pan off, reseal it, so on and so forth, at least by my preliminary investigation and preliminary findings. But everything that we did in this video was a huge success, huge things accomplished, and big items checked off of the list of things to do for this car still. That seems to be indefinite, infinite, but for those of you who build cars for yourself as a hobby or have your own projects, you know that's exactly the spot that you want to be in. So with another good few days worth of work done on the Supra and done on projects around here, I think it's going to be about the end of this video. So made good progress on this thing, and there will be more progress coming on that thing in the very near future. But for right now, we're going to end this video before I drone on and before we get into anything else. So thank you guys as always for tuning in, for coming along on this ride with me. I love having you all along for it. I love showcasing all these different projects and all the things that I'm doing around here. And it's always really cool, and it warms my heart that you guys want to come along for the ride with me. So from the bottom of my heart, I thank you very much, and thank you for your continued support and coming along for this with me. So before I drone on, before I ramble incessantly, let's go ahead and wrap this up. So as always, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, and I will see you guys in the next episode.